Hi. So we have decided together with Keng to start with a short text, which is the result of our conversations from the starting of this project, and which has been the different topics, ideas, reflections that we have been sharing from the beginning until today, here now. So first we are going to read this, and then I will give the mic to Keng and to follow in another mood this first reflections that we have been trying to write. In a short text published in 2004 under the title Carnival and Cannibal, Jean Baudrillard says we could resume Marx's famous line that history repeats itself first as an authentic event, then as farce. Baudrillard continues with, quote Marx, modernity could be thus conceived as Western Europe's initial adventure and then as a farce that it is repeated in a global scale in all latitudes to where Western religious, technical, economic, and political values are exported. This carnivalizing passes through the stages, also historical, of evangelization, colonization, decolonization, and globalization. What is less perceived is that this hegemony, this empowerment of a world order, the models of which not only technical and military, but cultural and ideological seem irresistible, is accompanied by an extraordinary reversal where this power is slowly devoured, cannibalized by the very people that is carnivalized. The prototype of this silent cannibalization, its primeval scene, or rather, its foundation stage, as suggested Sueli Rolnik, would be the solemn high mass of Recife, Brazil, in the 16th century, where the bishops, expressly coming from Portugal to celebrate the Indians' passive conversion, are devoured by them, an excess evangelical love, cannibalism as the extreme form of hospitality. The first victims of this evangelical masquerade, the Indians, spontaneously take it to the limit and beyond. They physically absorb those who spiritually absorb them. This double carnivalistic and cannibalistic form. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm already lost in my. I always have this problem. This double carnivalistic and cannibalistic form is what we see replicated everywhere at a global scale with the export of its moral values, human rights, democracy, its principles of economic rationality, as Andre says, growth, performance, and spectacle. Baudrillard claims that in this great collective spectacle, the West disguises itself not only with the spoils of all other cultures in its museums, its fashion, and its art, but also in the remain spoils of its own culture. And in this turn of events, art also fully plays its part. Picasso represents the best of a primitive art, and then the African artist copies Picasso as part of an international aesthetic. So all the decor of multiracial, modern, is but a trompe-l'oeil universe where cultural particularities would have been falsified to become parodies of themselves. In those days, quote Marx, in those days, this is from Borges, in those days, the world of mirrors and the world of men were not, as they are now, cut off from each other. They were also very diverse. Neither beings nor colors nor shapes were the same. Both kingdoms, the specular and the human, lived in peace. They came in and out through the mirrors. One night, the mirror people invaded the earth. Their power was great, but after bloody battles, the magic arts of the Yellow Emperor prevailed. He repelled the invaders, imprisoned them in their mirrors, and forced them to repeat, as though in a kind of dream, all the actions of men. He deprived them of their power and their forms and reduced them to mere slavish reflexes. One day, however, they will shake off that magical lethargy. The first to awaken will be the fish. Deep in the mirror, we will perceive a very faint line, and the color of that line will be like no other. Then the other forms will gradually awaken. Little by little, they will differ from us. Little by little, they will not imitate us. They will break through the barriers of glass or metal, and this time will not be defeated. If we recreate Borges' parable on the world of mirrors, where the defeated, relegated to the other side of the mirror, are reduced to a resemblance to the mere image reflection of their conqueror, but gradually start to seem less like them until one day they would cross the mirror to the other side and put an end to the emperor's hegemony. If we consider what is really happening in this planetary confrontation, what we see is that subjected peoples, far from resembling their masters less and less and taking their liberating revenge, contrarily, they have become increasingly more like them, grotesquely indulging their model, overestimating the signs of their servitude, which is the other way of taking revenge, a fatal strategy. It is fatal for both. It is all the whiteness, burying the blackness under the guise of the carnival. But the whiteness is not chiefly a racial identity. It certainly includes some ethnic features of the whiteness of the white man, but only as incarnations of more decisive features that are ethical and that characterize a certain kind of human behavior, a strategy of life or survival. A certain white appearance is required to define the identity of modern and capitalist man. And it's all the blackness absolving the whiteness under the guise of the cannibal. Carnivalization against cannibalization. And if the hangover of this huge movement taking place today, of this consecutive farce of history, forced us to think more responsibly and with greater care about our work of artist, our commitment as curators, our duty as spectators, what decisions would we take? The answer certainly cannot be univocal. We would like, however, within the framework of this symposium, to extend this question that have emerged from Sigrid Garay's invitation to a group of us, curators of the performing arts, from 6 different parts of the world, to share first all together, then in different tandems, our experience as mediators, drivers, vehicles, transmitters, translators, transducers, we could say so many things, of an artistic experience through a practice that had resisted the curatorial function and the term itself, long reserved to the field of the fine and the visual arts, first carnivalized and cannibalized prey in this decaying theater of globalization before becoming its new target. Performing artist, international festival director and curator Keng from Singapore, and I, performing artist and co-director of MAPA Teatro, Laboratory of Artists of Bogotá, chose each other to form a tandem that would exchange its south-to-south experiences bypassing the mediation of the north perspective. Of course, because of our origins or our artistic training, neither Keng nor I embody the South as a specific identitarian typology, but we have both wanted to reflect on some particular conditions of life in this part of the world that commonly appears in the bottom part of the map of the earth, and that in the field of our artistic cultural practices and in our subjectivities and representations have been subjected to a certain history and geopolitics of the carnivalized cannibal. Our mutual, and we would say anthropophagic, as Osvaldo de Andrade thought this as an ethic and aesthetic posture, our mutual anthropophagic need has led us, first as artists, to devour many years the culture that identifies Western modernity, and to have its power become a creating force which, combine with our cannibal traditions and practices. Keng comes from a Chinese family settled in Singapore, has produced a perspective and a way of being in the world with its own singularity in both the works of Theatre Works, the group created and directed by Keng on his return to Singapore, and in the works of MAPA Teatro, the artists' laboratory created and co-directed by Heidi, Abderhalden, and I in Colombia. The experience of humiliation we have lived as artists from that part of the planet, as part of the colonial unconscious that cuts through us, and I dare use here this notion proposed by Sueli Rolnik, which she herself will be presenting tomorrow, this notion of colonial unconscious. Together with the experience of privileged individuals that we, Keng, Heidi, and I are, have allowed us to imagine tactics and counter dispositives that do not reduce the curatorial practices in the performing arts to a mere instrumental category, but rather try to deflect with a high load of ethical, aesthetical, and political responsibility, the course of a history doomed to become a farce, the carnivalization and cannibalization of our artistic practices. Both of us, in our own way, the open, which is the platform Onkinsen is going to talk now about, but perhaps before his flying circus project in Southeast Asia, conceived and directed by Onkinsen and his team at Theatre Works, and Experimenta Sur, as Katia Cassin just mentioned, curated by Mapa Teatro team, both backed by institutions like the Goethe Institute, supporting them financially, Katia Cassin of the Goethe Institute of Bogotá, and Heinrich Blömecke of the Goethe Institute Southeast Asian office, and Joachim Gersmeyer, that I say hello, coordinator of the performing arts of the Siemens Stiftung, who has promoted this initiative in South America, have had to build, so we together had to build an arch to resist both the movement that ushers these proposals to their profitability and artistic producibility and vying for the legitimacy to the institutions that finance them by means of media visibility and to justify their existence. So our tactic has been to remove ourselves from the very idea of a festival, its production policy, and make it available to artists outside the regime of the spectator and the logic of consumption implied, to rather produce platforms, 2 different platforms for meeting an experimental temporary artistic community for young artists from all countries of the region. In the case of the Theatre Works project, we refer to the South Asian countries, almost all with much less prosperous economies than Singapore's, of course, and for Experimenta Sur, Colombia, from all South American countries, including those that do not appear in our mental maps, such as Paraguay, and from some other Latin American countries to where the call has been extensive. Our meetings have no purpose other than to activate and intensify an intensity of thought in the place of creation, privileging above all the profusion of questions and concerns that cross our practices, our modes of production and dissemination, our ways of creating worlds where geographically, economically, and politically the world seems to end, launching provocations and producing confrontations with radical thinkers that destabilize the agenda of thought, and with works of artists who confront perceptions, sensations, effects, and which do not normally mingle in our festivals or official scenarios or stages for being too controversial or of little profit. And that then, at the end of their presentations, devote several days to disassemble their work or to present a problem or to simply wander around the city in the company of the participants. 2 weeks dedicated to the meeting of the bodies and subjectivities, to listening and conversations, to questions and discussions, to answers and confrontations as spectators, artists, dinners, guests, while we wander together in public and private spaces or in the privacy of our homes, in the different laboratories of the social imagination we try to create. If Marx said that the praxis is, quote Marx, the fundamental human activity under which man produces historical reality and produces itself, what does a curatorial practice in the field of the performing arts mean that is not itself a performative praxis, an ethical praxis that seeks, through actions, processes, and experimental communities, to encourage the creation of realities and transform the repertorial behaviors, the cultural catalogues, the embodied imaginaries that prevent or restrict the production of our own subjectivities out of the logic of the rational subject, as André said before. So,
okay, yeah, how are you? All right. Thank you very much for having me here, and I thought that it will be perhaps more in line with the spirit of this whole thing being a 2-year process to try to have a more improvisational response to what Rolf has been writing about, and also, of course, to try to think of whatever I have on my laptop as just a kind of a landscape from which I can pluck certain things to actually reference and talk about. I think that it's a little bit more complicated than what Rolf has talked about for me in the last 2 years, because I was very happy doing my PhD with Andre in NYU, and then I was called back to Singapore to make this first independent festival. And for me, it's been also this journey with Sigrid has been actually a reflection of my own process in the last 2 years, where I moved from informal curating of processes, to formal curating of festivals, curating in venues, curating in institutions, right? So I'm making a kind of a divide here, because I think that what I was doing before in the Flying Circus project, which is a kind of a laboratory of processes, is really a time where in 1 year, in 2007, we called it jokingly, like riffing off United Airlines catalog, 100 hours in a city, right? 100 perfect hours in Seattle, or 100 perfect hours somewhere. We called it 100 perfect hours in the company of artists, where nothing happens, but we're just in the company of artists. And I think that it's more complicated because for me personally, I found that in the last 2 years, I've been making this constant travel between Singapore and Europe, where Europe becomes a placemaker because I can't go back to New York. And in a way, it becomes, because it's 12 hours rather than 20 hours away, but we're still talking about 12 hours. And this question of the affinities that I have here with my many friends and artists and curators, and that I'm constantly making this journey. So this 2 days ago, yesterday when I arrived, I got on the plane and I said, when can I stop making this travel? It's becoming ridiculous, right? It's becoming ridiculous because you have to be in the presence, and yet it's so traumatic on the body and on the experience and on the earth and all these larger things. So in a way, I think that Andre's first keynote speech was really to think about us destroying the paradigms and how we're still trapped in these paradigms. So that's the first thought that I had, and we had a chance to meet in Paris a couple of maybe 10 days ago, and between that I went back to Singapore, and now I'm here in Munich. And this question of what should we do for this tandem, and we talked about. I started off from the perspective that, as a curator, very often you are put into the place where you're asking yourself the questions, two basic questions, I think, that what do you want to protect? What do you need to protect? And I think that especially in a very right-wing country like Singapore, the arts or people who work in the arts need to protect certain things. The next question is that how can you also remain open to the world or open to other thoughts, other things, rather than just protecting this space, right? So how do you remain open and how do you protect yourself? And I see that as a kind of metaphor of how we live, right? I mean, being a gay man, I think very much about the whole impact of AIDS and how we open ourselves, but we also protect ourselves. And this was a whole change of thinking about sex, I think, in my lifetime anyway. And so I want to try to move into some elements of practice, because I feel like this is how I've been gripped in the last 2 years by this sudden job that fell on my lap. And I think I have I want to start with 3 things about what a festival is. A festival, one, is generation of product by curators, from commissioning to inviting to presenting. Festival is 2, opportunities of making, touring, trading, and circulation for artists. And 3, festivals as consumerism by audiences. So these are the 3 kind of very, very strong tenets, especially when you're working within curating festivals for cities. I think this is a very clear, almost like what we call in Singapore KPIs, performance indicators. And I come from Asia, where everything is about product. Everything is about consuming product. And production is only for consumption, right? There's no production which is useless. So, and this question of how do we, as curators and artists, or curators, hyphenated artists, work today, where there is the trap of our audiences in the times of populism all over the world. And this whole question of our audiences, how many times have we heard curators saying to each other or to us, or in a conversation, that I don't think this will make it for my audience. I don't think this is going to work for my audience. And so this whole question of my audience, his audience, her audience, our audiences, is very, very central. And I want to just go back to the 3-day, well, I was there for a week in Bogotá. And I think the first day was very interesting, because Rolf kept saying to me that, okay, you have to be careful, because you're very high up in the world, right? It's 3,000 meters above sea level. And the first day was about finding equilibrium with the physical environment. And this, for me, is very, very specific, I think, to curatorial work, which is this relational context, right? That, I mean, if I'm curating a festival in Berlin, which Andre and I had a chance to, and we discovered many things, and curating a festival in Singapore is this question about the relational context, which is, what do you have to do to be a disruption in this context? And this was the first day in Bogotá, which was to find the equilibrium with the physical environment, and that you're high up so that you don't collapse from exhaustion. And then after that, the next few days, I found myself constantly in micro communities. So this question of macro politics, micro politics, and how in these micro communities, I was very much finding myself in the kind of research work that I would do when I'm curating for the Flying Circus project. And the Flying Circus project, for those of you who are not aware, it's a kind of a project where artists from all over the world, we come together and we travel together and we produce nothing. So we are in some kind of interface with public conversations like this, and of course something is produced, but nothing is produced in the terms of Nancy, right? Of Jean-Luc Nancy, talking about that production is, in a sense, commodification, fetishization of the product. and how he is talking very much about how do we produce nothing. And I think that this whole question of my life suddenly becoming profoundly different, which was that now in the City Festival of Singapore International Festival of Arts, SIFA, I have to curate for audiences, and how many % of the audiences are coming to the shows, what is your ticket box office, la 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 la. And before that, when I was making the Flying Circus for, I suppose, 15 years, where we were working inside these micro communities producing nothing, in inverted commas. So I think that these micro communities which I met in Bogotá, Rolf, Heidi, and in hospitality, the conviviality of having dinner at home, and then subsequently going to the MA course. And this MA course of interdisciplinary performance is very much reminded me so much of my time in Das Arts when I was a mentor there, where we are in our own space, and it's a protected space, or we have to try to protect it, right? We have to try to protect this space. And how can this space continue to generate nothing, in inverted commas? And I was lucky to also go to a gallery, Casas Reigner, where there you had a different sort of process of curating. A gallery owner who is looking after her artists, right? And how I found it very interesting, because she was creating these different spaces in her gallery, in her commercial gallery, where you walk behind and there's a smaller gallery where some kind of oeuvre of artists is put forward, questioning or thinking about some topic. And she was publishing a lot. And then you go upstairs beyond the commercial gallery, and then you see an upstairs gallery where her staff is curating a show which is made by an artist that doesn't belong to the gallery. So this kind of slippage or outside of the box way of thinking, and I found that really interesting, because at the end of our conversation, she said, Hans Ulrich Obrist is coming, and we're all preparing a project today together. And I thought to myself, what can Hans Ulrich Obrist teach you or share with you when you're already doing these wonderful things? And of course, I'm simplifying and talking about something where at the back is the spectra of the market, right? I mean, the gallery owner has the market to justify, and this is always there. And I think that these microclimates, meeting some of micro communities, meeting some of her artists, meeting the students in the MA for interdisciplinary performance, it really brought up a whole urgency of finding alternative currencies in curating, right? And this is something which has been going on for a very long time, but we haven't really been effectively. We're searching for these alternative currencies, and in a way, we're still struggling with that. And I'm just going to kind of run through some quotes, because I think these quotes immediately place what I'm talking about. Jean-Luc Nancy, in his book about mondialization, where he talks about the displacement of production. Quote, "The commodity form, which is the fetishized form of value, must dissolve itself, sublimate, or destroy itself. In any case, revolutionize itself." And so he talks about a space beyond production itself, which Nancy terms enjoyment. So the whole question of how do we as curators and artists and audiences enjoy and not feel guilty because we are enjoying on public money? And this whole question of, I mean, he talks a lot, and this whole book is interesting. He has certain direct action related, the idea of being engaged in the world. I mean, he talks of being in the world, right? And I think this is very, very important for me, which is that how can we make works with an audience where they are being in the world with us and not being in the world, right? Where they are passively watching from outside, and perhaps what they are watching justifies their prejudices and it doesn't really bring us all of us in this triangle, bring us all into new spaces. So and this idea of creating nothing. So how can curating be about curating nothing? And he has a wonderful lecture where he talks about love and community, and he talks about sharing nothing, sharing the space in between here. And of course, the space in between is really related a lot to the Japanese aesthetics of ma, the space and the time in between. And he plays with this kind of, I love this quote because it's funny, and he becomes quite funny. He says, "Nothing is not nothing." Quote, "Nothing is something. It is a something of no thing." No thing. In English, you can do that. This no thing, nothing. Right? What is nothing? I would say this is everything which is not a thing. You and me, for example, who here would accept to be a thing, all right? But then what, of course, is that immediately we have this morning's talk by Andre, where we are encouraged to look at things, where persons could be things, not objects, but in this kind of intermediate space of the thing. And I think that what's coming across for me is a lot of what Paul Gilroy talks about, of adopting a more generous and creative view of how human beings might communicate or act in concert across racial, ethnic, or civilizational divisions. So this whole question of, this whole question of how curating can be also be unabashed humanism, which culminates in a new way of being at home. And I think that this whole question of a new way of being at home in the world, moving against national solidarity, national culture, privileging other more open affiliations. And for me, this whole quote by Gilroy, where he talks about quote, "the translocal impact of political ideologies, social relations, and technological changes that have fostered a novel sense of interdependence, simultaneity, and mutuality, in which the strategic and economic choices made by one group on our planet in Singapore may be connected in a complex manner with the lives, hopes, choices of others who may be very far away in Bogotá." Right? So I want to end with just three kind of central thoughts, and they are really questions which I think that we're still in the midst of thinking about, puzzling through. One is curating beyond production, curating nothing. Two, curating as a process to remain enchanted. And in that sense, the flip side is curating disgust. And here I have to just give some contextual quotes, mostly taken from Sue Bennett in her wonderful book about enchantment. And she talks about how the effective turn of enchantment, where ethical generosity can arise unpredictably, right? That means you have the effective turn of enchantment, where ethical generosity can arise unpredictably. And she has a completely different perspective from Nancy, right? She wants to animate pleasure. Well, and not really, because he does talk about enjoyment too. But to animate pleasure to rescue ethical life. And I like this line where she says that we need to harness consumerism, materialism, and commodification strategically, for cynicism reduces expectations of the state. and thus diminishes the will to respond collectively to injustices. Cynicism reduces expectations of the state, and thus diminishes the will to respond collectively to injustices. So this question of curating enchantment, where we are not cynical, or curating disgust, where what we're doing is on the surface, or maybe exactly because it's on the surface, useless. That's the second thought, and I think the last, which I would like to talk about, is huge. But this idea of curating potentiality, where you are not curating products or production, but you're curating potentiality. And potentiality, I very recently I was involved in 2 years, ever since I started this festival, of making, of reflecting on archives in contemporary dance in Japan. And because there we are working in Japanese, so of course the first thing that comes up is this whole question of what's the difference between potential and potentiality? And then you're like, it's like, okay, how do we explain this, right? How do we talk about potential and potentiality? And and I came across this very simple definition, which I really like, which is, of course, segueing into Agamben's way of thinking about potentiality, and where potentiality in English means the state or quality of possessing, embodying latent power or capacity, latent capacity, capable of coming into being or action at a later time, right? So that it's not just potential and actual, but there's this whole gray space, what do you call shadow space, right? Where Agamben talks about it, that he tries to break down this binary of potential and actual, but there is this potentiality that is latent, that is in you, and in a sense, because it's in you, it is embodied, and that it's latent, waiting to come into being. So, where are we now? We are this question of curating potentiality, and in a way, it's a very tall order, right? We try to curate nothing. We try to curate enchantment, and which is again the opposite of nothing. Enchantment and disgust. So it's kind of extreme. And then the question of curating potentiality. So perhaps maybe that's a good place to end. Right? So thank you very much.